past few years, but especially in the last 6 months or so, we have seen an exponential increase in activities in the Eastern Mediterranean that have caused upheaval in the region and in the international community. Erdogan's aggression in the Mediterranean, the UAE and Israel signing an agreement, Iran's precariousness, and it seems like at the center of it is energy. During this time, the US relationship towards the Eastern Med is also changing. Most notably, in December 2019, President Trump signed the Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act of 2019, a bipartisan bill authored by Senator Menendez of New Jersey and Senator Rubio of Florida. The legislation is a comprehensive recalibration of American diplomatic, military, and economic policy towards the Eastern Med, and a strong and prosperous alliance between the US, Greece, Israel, and Cyprus. With us today is John Defterios, CNN Business's Emerging Markets editor and an anchor on CNN, based in Abu Dhabi. His reporting focuses on the top business stories from emerging economies with a specialty in trade, geopolitics, and energy. John, thank you for joining us and lending your expertise to this incredibly important and complicated topic, and for helping us navigate the evolving dynamics of the region.
Yeah, I'm pleasure to be here. It's a lot of change all the time, Christiana, in the region. So it's a good time for us to talk.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The Eastern Mediterranean remains both a heated area and one that holds a great deal of promise. Why is there so much interest in this energy basin?
Well, one of it's because of proximity, of course, because we're looking at the southern flank of Europe with access to one of the largest markets in the world. This was an area that was undiscovered. I have followed Egypt really carefully because in the last 5 years has been a game changer with the exploration activities of BP and Eni bringing it to market. But Egypt, prior to the discoveries in the Eastern Med, used to pay 50% of its budget just on oil and gas imports. So it's radically changed the equation for Egypt. And then people started to look into the neighborhood, Israel specifically. Now we see Greece and Cyprus doing the same and say this has a lot of potential. And in fact, it's a good counterbalance to Russia with its dominance of about 40% into the European Union market. There's also gas coming from Norway. So it's not overly dependent on Russia, but it's good to have options. Prior to these major discoveries in the basin, not developed to their potential yet, we had gas coming in from Algeria, going through to Italy, great, phenomenal potential in Libya as well, but unexplored, and it's a failed state. So seeing this alliance of Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, potentially even Lebanon in the future, would change the game in terms of supplies coming from different sources feeding into the European Union.
So these recent developments, you'd say, challenge Russia's supremacy as a gas supplier to Europe, and maybe even Turkey's role as a gas transit hub?
Well, that's a great point. Number one, as I was saying before, Russia has about 40% penetration, even higher in Eastern and Central Europe. But the largest economy, Germany, hovers around 40%. With the Nord Stream 2, that would climb to penetration of 60 to 70%. And this is why the US is trying to resist this effort and send natural gas through LNG coming from the Gulf of Mexico into Europe. The potential at this stage of the Eastern Med and whether they can build that pipeline, which is a substantial project of nearly $7 billion, is that we see penetration of 4 to 5%. So it's not something that's going to radically change the market, but that's not to think that this could grow over time, because once you have the infrastructure, once you have the exploration done in the first round, like they did in Egypt, more fields can be discovered. So this is something obviously Russia doesn't want to risk. It particularly hits Turkey as a transit hub, so it would lose a revenue stream. Obviously, Turkey uses the gas that's imported from Russia. And most recently, President Erdogan has said he's made discoveries in the Black Sea, and kind of the dangerous language is that he would like to be a net importer now, basically shifting to a net exporter in the next 5 years, which means he has designs on the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a tricky equation. Mm-hmm. This is not new to me, the geopolitics of energy. Some of it's grandstanding, some is aspirational, but clearly this is a flashpoint. Final thought on this is that I chair an event in Germany every year. It's an off-the-record event with about 175 senior executives and policymakers. And we had one person on the background discussion that I had suggesting that the Eastern Med is the most volatile and dangerous part of the world right now. And this is somebody very senior intelligence official from Eastern Europe. So, having somebody suggest that, and you look at the dynamics at play right now, clearly it's something that should be on our radar and something that could be rather tenuous as time goes forward, depending on the stakes at play here.
Mm-hmm. And so you speak of this volatility. How does this crazy new factor of the COVID-19 impact energy specifically, and what does that mean for our demands in fossil fuel and gas? Like, what is this perfect storm being formed?
Well, that's interesting, because if it extends further, it could hurt demand for a longer period of time, then hold back investment into the Eastern Med. I don't see that, but what a shock, because we had a sell-off in 2015 and 16. We had another challenge in 2017, 18, and then we had a 30% collapse. I've been covering energy for 30 years, and we've never seen a 30% collapse in global demand for energy. Year on year, we're looking at a fall of 9 to 10%, according to OPEC and the International Energy Agency. But March, April, that was a shock that we've never seen before. It is the first time that oil prices in the United States went negative, albeit for 24 hours. Mm-hmm. But even as we speak today, oil prices are under pressure again because of the second and potentially third wave of the COVID-19 and how much it holds back investment in the future. So we saw prices and volatility of 6-7% on the downside. This is after OPEC had cut, right, substantially in the spring months and into the summer, and it's still holding back production from the market through 2020 and would extend it into 2021 if necessary.
So what would you say the overall impact on oil and gas producing states is of this price volatility and the decrease of demand?
Okay, well, a few things. Let's look closer to home for you in the United States. I was just doing a piece on the amount of bankruptcies that we're seeing in the shale basins of the United States, and it's pretty radical. Over 5 years, we're looking at nearly 500 bankruptcies of oil and gas companies, service companies, midstream companies, carrying debt, and this has been the big problem of nearly $300 billion. So they leverage themselves up because of the shale boom and expansion. The global demand, if you think about it, we consume about 100 million barrels a day. That's dropped dramatically this year, but globally 100 million barrels a day. The US was #1 in the world in the first quarter of this year at 13 million barrels a day. So you ask the impact. We've knocked out 3 million barrels a day within 9 months. Again, an extraordinary shock and causing unemployment, for example, even in the Midland Basin area of Texas, which almost had full employment at 2.1% when I visited last year. The unemployment rate is knocking on the door of 10%, so a 5-fold increase. Then you shift over, Christiana, to say Saudi Arabia. They produce oil, and this is a shocking number, $2 to $6 a barrel. So one of the lowest cost producers in the world. Abu Dhabi, where I'm sitting, is the same way. But the break-even budget for Saudi Arabia is around $80 to $84 a barrel. So they're overspending to kind of keep the peace and stability of the nation. So even though they produce it for a low amount, $40 where we are today doesn't work for Saudi Arabia. Russia, with all the sanctions that they've had on them over the last 10 years for a number of different issues, has learned to live with $40 a barrel. That's its break-even price for its budget, but it's not succeeding. It doesn't grow at this point. So to your question, nobody wins at $40 a barrel, but the one that suffers a great deal is the United States, which is not a very high-cost producer, but a break-even price of 40 to 45. They don't make money at this level, let's put it that way.
So, you spoke of how this affects us at home, closer to home in the US, but the nature of geopolitics is that things happen far away from home, and they actually have direct effect with us. So you're based out of the Middle East in Abu Dhabi. You just spoke of how $40 barrels are break even for Russia, barely make it work for Saudi Arabia. So how does this strain these states, these nation states?
Well, this is a huge question that you bring up, because it is almost a perfect storm because of the COVID-19 shock, which is probably temporary, but it could carry on for 2-3 years of very slow growth worldwide, so that'll hurt demand. But prior to COVID-19, we're seeing quite an aggressive acceleration to investment in solar and wind power. And last year was the first year in global investment in energy, which was about $1.3 trillion. It was almost 50-50 in renewables and the other 50% in hydrocarbons, something we've never seen before. So what does it tell us is that the energy transition is underway. So there was a narrative or discussion 3-4 years ago at Davos at the World Economic Forum, where I chair an energy event every year, that they thought they had 50 or 60 years, Christiana, of demand for oil holding up, and they could live kind of happily ever after and prepare for a 50-year lead run, right?
Mhm.
What we're looking at today is likely a transition. I'm saying not the wiping out of oil and gas, but a transition where we see demand dropping 30 to 35, 40% over the next 20 to 30 years. So the last man standing, or the last producer standing, will be the ones where I sit in the Middle East, because they're the low-cost producers.
Mhm.
But at which price, right? And how competitive can the shale producers be if there's price pressure on the downside for years to come?
Yeah.
Russia survives this game, and there's going to be a lot more demand. A lot of people don't know this. A lot more demand for natural gas, because natural gas is going to be used for electrification to balance out the solar power and the wind power that's coming online. And a lot of the money and the investment that I'm talking to you about is going into battery storage right now, because you need to be able to store solar and wind energy. And that's a challenge now, and battery storage is very expensive. But, you know, I'm a firm believer, very much like what you've seen what's happened to our smartphones and our laptops and iPads and the rest, right? The change is coming, and the innovation will hit. So for battery storage, the use of natural gas and electrification, the pervasiveness of electric cars. I still remember the conversation people said when the horse-drawn carriage was there in the early 1900s, that the automobile never would have a chance. And in 17 years, there was 15 million cars sold, right, for the Model T for Ford. So when it does hit, as we've seen with the smartphone and all the technology we've seen, it'll also be pervasive in the energy sector as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you speak of the energy transition, because this is fascinating and is happening in rapid speed. And you host a documentary on CNN called Global Energy Challenge. Where has that taken you, and what have you learned in respect to the energy transition?
Well, the worst part of it is, and this is not part of the discussion, as prevalent part of the discussion as it should be, right? There's not one person I've spoken to in the last 18 months of working on the documentary and airing the documentary. We're going to be entering the second season now, that believes that we can hit the target of 1.5% centigrade by 2050 to stay within the Paris targets. So that should be very alarming for your generation. It's alarming for my generation, my children's generation, that nobody thinks we can hit that target unless we accelerate the transition to renewables. So it's alarming that we're behind the curve. You'd have to be a fool not to see what's taking place in Australia with the fires that we saw at the start of 2020, what we see in California today, the veracity of the hurricanes that took place off the Gulf Coast. It's very early in the hurricane season, and we already had a dozen or 14 major storms. It is shocking how far behind the curve we are right now. So that's one thing I learned kind of upfront and personal. And then we went literally to Russia, Kazakhstan, India, South Korea, into Africa, to Latin America. I spent a 2-week period in the United States looking at the development of shale, but also going to California, looking at the transition to renewable energy. It's an extremely steep hill to climb to accelerate the investment and accelerate the take-up of renewable energy. You go to some markets, smaller countries like Norway and Sweden, and it's incredibly impressive what they've announced. COVID-19 was a shock to the European Union. They reacted. Germany, France, leading the way in the transition across the board. I would invite our viewers tonight to listen and take a look at what the European Union's doing vis-a-vis the United States. We have pockets of states doing things like California, New York, Texas is doing a good job, even though it's a major oil and gas producer and even an exporter right now. But that concentration of making the transition is great. I'd say 75% of the United States, 80% of the United States not tuning in, and it's dangerous. So we should accelerate that investment. And to be frank, it's something that President Trump has been a denier about. He's actually pushed out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but has not encouraged the investment into renewables. And this is a strategic mistake for the United States. But I think globally, we have a responsibility to accelerate the process that I'm talking about. It's been a fantastic series. It's online if people want to look at it, the Global Energy Challenge. Just search into CNN, but you'll learn a lot in terms of what the world's faced with and what different countries are doing.
We'll include a link on the bottom of our YouTube page and on the page for anybody who wants to jump into that. So speaking of bilateral relations agreements, let's pivot a little bit our conversation into that. The newfound balances. So the Trump administration is working to have a long-lasting peace agreement in the Middle East, starting with the UAE and Israel, which we saw signed recently. The economic boycott against Israel has already been lifted. So what's the potential here? And how could it affect the Eastern Med and in Greece and Cyprus particularly?
There's a lot to unpack there, but this is a fantastic question, right? So number one, this is my 9th year full-time in the UAE. I've been coming here since 2007 regularly, at least on a monthly basis. Covered the Gulf War in 1990, 1991, right? So the invasion of Kuwait and thereafter the war between the United States and Iraq, which was very short and brief, of course. But having said that, if you're going to say in 2020 we have a Gulf state, one of the 6 Gulf states like the UAE, engaging with Israel, I would say it was impossible. The phone lines prior to this agreement, I couldn't call Israel on a UAE phone. So there was no communication between the Gulf states and Israel. Now, the strategic nature of the UAE is impressive. They think things through in a very wide spectrum and thinking long-term about their interests. I've got a different position than most on this. I think the UAE is looking at potentially a change in leadership in the United States. So they have to hedge their bets. Yes, it's a good thing to support Donald Trump and Jared Kushner's Middle East peace plan. That's how they saw it. Same thing for Israel. But think about it in a different way. If Joe Biden comes in and he potentially re-engages with Iran, I'm not saying signs the nuclear agreement, but say re-engages with Iran, you have 2 players that didn't talk to each other before that now understand each other and have a common platform in which to build. The UAE only has 10 million citizens. Less than 10% of the population is Emirati, right? So they feel vulnerable. This is a good alliance from a security perspective for the UAE. It is called Little Sparta, since we have a Greek community we're speaking to here. Because of its nature, it's small but powerful because of its sovereign wealth, which is about $1.2 trillion. And it could lead by example. So there was Egypt and Jordan, of course, but not one Gulf state would do this. Saudi Arabia is the biggest economy. For the UAE, feel confident enough, Christiana, to step forward and say, we're going to normalize relations with Israel was a bold statement. We saw hints of it, by the way, if you're a local. And for example, we had intelligence cooperation between the UAE and Israel we've heard about, never saw. There was a group called Group 42 that does security intelligence that signed an agreement with Israel before the normalization of relations. And my colleagues and I here were saying that's something because it happened about 2 or 3 months before the formal agreement. And as soon as the formal agreement was signed, we've seen collaboration on COVID-19. I would expect it on biosecurity and also biomedicine as well. And also the testing point for this is going to be the F-35 jet fighter, right? Because Lockheed Martin wants to be able to sell it to the UAE. The UAE said it's part of the agreement. But when they did normalize relations, even last week during a visit here, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel said he wasn't ready to clear it. So they have this agreement with the United States that Israel maintains its military superiority in the Middle East. So this is going to be a point of either contention or collaboration. It's too early to tell which one that'll be right now. But it's off to a phenomenal start. The language that they're talking about, Israeli delegation came last week here to the UAE. Very smooth sailing, a lot of background discussions, but they left on the same page here on what they want to build in the future. Finally, and I don't mean to carry on too long, this is a move by the UAE with Israel to set up an alliance against Iran, right? Again, because of what we've seen in the last 3 years in the breaking of the nuclear accord, the tensions in the region have been very high. The UAE thinks this is a good way to have an alliance with a very strong military player in the region. And Israel sees it as an ability to sign one, but multiple countries from the GCC or the Gulf Cooperation Council in partnership aligned against Iran. Does it dial down the nervousness and tension in the region? I don't think so, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz. But you can see the politics at play here, and why the UAE and Israel came together.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of Israel, if we look to its role in the Eastern Mediterranean, so along with President Trump's the 2019 Act for the Eastern Med Security and Energy, there was a trilateral agreement between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, named with the same title, the Eastern Mediterranean Energy and Security Act. So our bilateral relations between Greece and Israel have been developing and getting progressively better and stronger. They just celebrated 30 years of bilateral relations. How does this affect the region and the energy field in particular?
Well, again, there's a couple of interesting twists here. Number one, Israel is expanding its reach. Before it signed this normalization with the UAE, Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Oman, which is like the Switzerland of the Gulf states, when the Sultan was still alive, who was in power for, I think, 45 years and passed away, unfortunately, in 2019. But having said that, so Israel reached out to Oman and has a dialogue. It reached out to UAE, has normalization with Egypt. It has that with Jordan. It only makes sense to extend west into the Mediterranean, right? They see eye to eye with Greece. I've talked to a number of diplomats at very senior levels on both sides. I've been to Israel myself about a dozen times. They feel very comfortable in the Mediterranean. They feel very comfortable with Cyprus. A very senior Cypriot diplomat in the Foreign Affairs Committee had talked about the alliance you're suggesting and said to me, it's tightly knit, meaning that it's not a kind of a flash in the pan, that they can build on it in the future. The other thing I would add to this, which is quite interesting, most Greeks probably don't know, is that the UAE really likes Greece. And they particularly like this Prime Minister, Mitsotakis. They find him a man of his word. They find him business friendly. So, you know, the Austere Palace in Athens, that's a consortium between the UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia in the private sector. Yeah. Major investment, transformative in what's taking place in that part of Athens. The whole coastline from the Austere going down towards central Athens, major investment by the UAE with the old Hellenic airport, of course, and the development there. Extraordinary level of investment. And I know for a fact through the ambassador here at the UAE, they just held a virtual summit between the UAE and Greece in July to expand the investment. So Greece has some very good allies extending into the Gulf states and a lot of trust right now. Yes. Israel has been trying to expand its influence into the Mediterranean for a security purpose. Cyprus and Greece are good partners in which to do so. Navigating what President Erdogan is doing right now is going to be a huge challenge because it's not a signatory to the law of the sea of the UN Convention in 1982, which creates a thorny issue because Cyprus and Greece keep on quoting the law of the sea in the UN Convention, right? Turkey is not a signatory, so it keeps on talking about the continental shelf that it has underneath the waters, that it has rights to those explorations. And as Prime Minister Mitsotakis recently said when I was in Greece, I will not sit down under the threat, kind of using metaphorically, a gun to my head, meaning the frigates into the Greek territories. So there's a willingness to sit down. There's been offers by NATO to get them to sit down together. But again, the Prime Minister of Greece has suggested he's not going to do so under threat, which seems very reasonable, of course. But it's a delicate period of time because of the demand needs for Turkey for natural gas and the desire by this president before he leaves office to be on the pathway to be a net exporter, not a net importer of fuel. So you can see the dynamics at play here. They're pretty risky and pretty dangerous.
Of course. So the UAE-Israel Accord, how does that impact the Iran-Turkey relationship? Iran remains a security flashpoint. You've mentioned it in this conversation a number of times. Iran remains a common enemy between Israel, the UAE, and the US. So what's the likely outcome?
Well, you know, there was more of a collaboration between Turkey and Iran, Christiana, 5 years ago. It's gone rather quiet because the president of Turkey has focused his attention as of late in Libya and actually has troops engaged in Libya, which is because of the assets that Libya has in natural gas and oil. It sits on the largest reserves in Africa by a wide margin. That has instigated some tensions with Egypt, which also has a very large military, and President al-Sisi, who's closely aligned with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, right? They've given him financial support in the past. So you can see the dynamics at play here. Turkey's not in good relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and some of the other states of the Gulf. It has tensions with Egypt because it's at play in Libya. Mm-hmm. But Turkey hasn't made an aggressive adventure to start re-engaging with Iran just yet. Now, Iran's looking for new partners because of the severity of the US sanctions. Mm-hmm. It has signed energy agreements with China. President Rouhani was even suggesting in the last week, why aren't his allies stepping up more aggressively and going against the US sanctions? China has its own tensions with the United States, so it's not doing so, but it is helping Iran financially. So has Russia on a limited basis. So Iran's mm-hmm. looking for new partners. I would not be surprised if, in fact, they re-engage with Turkey. And also, if, again, as I said earlier, if President Biden comes into office, I don't see the Iranian portfolio staying the way it is today. Mm-hmm. I don't think it would open as fast or as wide as it did under President Obama. But I do expect a change if that's the case. And I think the Iranians are trying to buy some time here. And going back to my earlier point, why the UAE and Israel are so closely aligned now, wondering what's going to happen in 2021, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've given us so much of your time and we really appreciate it. So I'll just leave you with one last question. What will the legacy of COVID from an economic standpoint be, in your opinion?
Well, this is a long-term discussion, but in fact, I just chaired a roundtable with 4 leading CEOs from around the world over the weekend. CEO of Honeywell, the CEO of the sovereign fund here in Abu Dhabi called Mubadala, which has better than $200 billion under assets, Schneider Electric, which is a global player in innovation, and the CEO of Siemens. Mm-hmm. They all said this is probably a generational change from COVID-19. I think it'll profoundly change the real estate commercial market in major cities around the world, right? Mm-hmm. We've learned how to have this discussion here, you in the United States and me on the other half of the world, and having a dialogue that we never thought would be possible, right? That's being duplicated around the world. I mean, Siemens put out a number of 800,000 meetings that they've held internally at Siemens since the start of COVID. So it's a game changer when it comes to real estate. I think it'll be a game changer for the large cities of the world because people will start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I'm not sure if it's going to have a profound impact on rural areas of the world, which do need to be developed and often forgotten. Even in the United States, we even see that in parts of Italy and Greece. You could see a better spread of investment. I'm not so confident on that. But the technology and the push for more innovation and e-learning, which has been very slow in the take-up, and in fact was behind the curve when COVID-19 hit, will change dramatically. But those in financial services, those in media, think about the fact that I have not been in our studio since COVID broke out. AT&T now owns Time Warner, and they suggested on a Wednesday that by Monday we would be broadcasting from our homes with the exception of very limited exception of people in New York and London to start with. And in a 5-day period, everybody was reporting from their home. I'm using an iPhone 5 to 6 days a week and broadcasting around the clock from my apartment or flat here in Abu Dhabi. And it meets the standard and actually in many respects looks better than many of our studios around the world. It's extraordinary what technology is doing today. Can we advance it in medicine at a faster pace because of it? Can we do so in education? Clearly in financial services, clearly in the media world. My worry is here, and this is my final thought, right? The US is going to go above 100% of debt to GDP in 2021. That I never thought we would see. So we're spending 13% of GDP on COVID-19, a fantastic response. But as all 4 of the CEOs told me during my roundtable, don't get addicted to debt because you're going to leave a legacy to the next generation. So I worry about the future of jobs for my daughters. We're 15 and 17 today. So this next generation is going to have a heavy burden. There's been a lot of studies. I invite our viewers and listeners to tune into, looking at a 10 to 15-year damage from a shock of this nature on the next generation of employees, starting with 20 to 25% less salaries to start, and then kind of carrying on as a legacy for them throughout their career if we're not careful. So should be a point of attention for everybody, for the youth. Make sure they get internship programs, make sure they get out and working. And I think the economic recovery is not going to be a quick one because of the debt legacy and the burden. As the CEO of Honeywell told me on the roundtable, higher taxes, budget cuts, and a strain on the financial markets that could last 2 to 3 years. That's what the global 100 are planning for today because of the shock of COVID-19.
Well, and then there's all the social ramifications, but we definitely don't have time to go through all that today. Thank you very much, John, for being here with us and lending your time and your expertise. So everybody, John Defterios, CNN Business Emerging Markets Editor from Abu Dhabi. Thank you very much, John. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for the invitation. I do appreciate it. Thanks very much.